Hello, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Vanishing Hour. We are coming from the closet nook once again. It's hot, it's stuffy, there's loud fan noises, and I will be gulping water during this recording. I will try to edit it out as much as possible, but this is what I have to do in order to stay alive in here. But let's get started. This episode is part 2 of what is now becoming a 3-part series of the Vanishing of Viking Sally. Just as a little recap, in part 1, we did discuss the origins of this infamous cruise ferry ship beginning in 1980, its first brush with death in 1986 when notorious Finnish serial killer Reijo Hammer stabbed, strangled, and murdered a man after being caught stealing from him. We also thoroughly discussed the events that took place a year later in 1987 when German travelers Klaus and Bettina were both attacked aboard the ship in the middle of the night. Klaus died from his injuries, and Bettina survived only to live with the physical and mental toll it has caused her. We discussed the evidence that was found aboard the ship and how, despite numerous findings, none led to a conviction. We also went over the main suspects, including Patrick, who was a crusty vagabond found covered in blood that was later found to be his own just hours after the attack. We discussed the couple's close friend and travel companion, Thomas Schmid. And we also went over the seemingly good-natured Boy Scout who located the victims and claimed to attempt to save them, who was named Thomas Nielsen. We discussed how the case went seemingly cold for more than 15 years until a tip to Danish police came in and alerted Finnish investigators of a suspect who had been running his mouth about the murders to several friends and family. The suspect's name was Herman Himley, who later turned out to be none other than Thomas Nielsen, the Boy Scout. We went over the severe mishandling of a confession from Nielsen that was obtained, and which was the catapult to charges being filed against him in 2019. He was ultimately acquitted due to what I can only describe as buffoonery on part of the police in this, investigation, and the case has continued on without anyone being legally found guilty of this crime. We left off wondering what had happened to Viking Sally after this and why potential evidence was not collected since then to maybe help propel the case further. This is because the Viking Sally, now referred to as the MS Estonia, sits below the surface of the Baltic Sea where it has remained since the horrific events that took place in September of 1994. And this is where our episode will be beginning. The sinking of the MS Estonia took place on Wednesday, September 28, 1994 at around 1 a.m. Prior to this, the Viking Sally had been sold and renamed several times, but again, at this particular time of its sinking, it was the pride of Estonia, a newly found independent country, after years of struggling for independence from both Germany and Soviet Russia. Its routes took it through the Baltic Sea, porting in Tallinn, Estonia, and Stockholm, Sweden. And this was precisely the route that it was taking the night of the sinking. This particular sinking of the MS Estonia is actually the 12th deadliest sinking in the world history during a time of peace. They categorize wartime sinkings differently, I guess, than times of peace. Now, before I go into more about the sinking, I do want to note that there is an excellent article that I used as a source that was published by The Atlantic and written by a man named William Langweisch. I'm so sorry if I am butchering that last name. I probably am. But it does go into immense detail in retelling the story of 2 survivors aboard the ship when it sank. The read is terrifying, it's gripping, and it makes you feel like you were there with how descriptive it was. I highly recommend it if you are interested in further first-hand detail about the sinking. Also, there is a docuseries on Prime Video titled Estonia, that interviews survivors, next of kin, some former public figures and leaders, as well as investigative journalists of various countries involved in this tragedy, and really the massive controversy that surrounds this sinking to this day. I highly, highly, highly recommend it as well. Again, Prime Video, and it's called Estonia. This is not an ad. This was literally just something that I had stumbled upon, and it was a really, really informative and well-directed docuseries. So I do recommend it. But moving on, these events have in no way been laid to rest, and many are still left with questions as to why this ship sank to begin with. There's so much that simply does not add up. We are going to try to cover as much of it as possible within these episodes. I'm sure there will be a lot that I miss, but this is going to be a thick episode, so prepare yourselves. Sorry also if you hear like little baby noises. I've tried to soundproof the best I can, but my 2-year-old has some powerful lungs and bad timing, I guess. Anyway, the MS Estonia departed slightly behind schedule at 7:15 p.m. on that Wednesday evening, and it was expected in Stockholm, Sweden the next morning at about 9 a.m. The journey does have it travel through a time zone of a difference of 1 hour. So that was extremely difficult to try to keep track of when going through a lot of the information I had, because a lot of the time frames were told in Estonian time, other time frames were told in Swedish time, and so there was a lot of confusion. I think I've cleared all of it up the best that I can, but just keep that in mind when I start going into details over the timeline. She was carrying 989 people, 803 of which were passengers, and the remaining 186 were crew members, all spanning over 17 different countries. Weather that night started out mild, but there was an expected storm to come that the crew was made aware of 24 hours in advance. There were some rain showers, and the wind speed was roughly 20 miles per hour leaving the port, and visibility was good. As the voyage progressed, the weather did become more turbulent out on the open water. According to one report, by midnight, the wind speeds had picked up to about 40 miles per hour, with wave heights reaching as high as 20 feet. Visibility was 10 nautical miles, and many passengers began to complain a little more so than usual about the listing of the ship, which is the swaying or the tipping from side to side as it rides over waves or choppy water. Now, despite the change in weather, this report states that the crew operating the ship maintained a full speed, which was 19 knots, give or take. Some other sources kind of differed on what full speed was. But we're going to estimate at around 19 knots, which is equal to 22 miles per hour. That doesn't sound very fast, but for a giant hunk of metal on choppy water, I'd say that's pretty fast, especially in kind of shitty weather. Now, despite how extreme these conditions may sound, both the ship and the crew were well versed in this type of weather and sailing through it. This was fairly common bad weather, in a sense, and they were familiar with how to handle things. Now, the first sign of trouble aboard the Estonia was when a metallic bang was heard that in later reports was presumably caused by a heavy wave hitting the bow doors at about 1 a.m. Passengers in decks 0 and 1 reported hearing the sound and seeing water trickling in from unknown areas. Some said it was seeping through bolts that were holding the ship together. Others said that they could not locate where the water was coming from. However, an alleged inspection limited to checking the indicator lights for both the ramp and visor at the front of the ship showed no signs of distress. Now, I had no idea what a visor was on a ship, so I did have to Google it. And I was shocked to see that this particular model of ferry, called a ro-ro ship, or roll-on, roll-off ship, has a visor, or like a nose at the nose of the ship, open upward like a mouth, where the ramp, which is wide and almost covers the entire entryway, can then lay down and allow for loading. This is only for like cargo loading. Passenger loading is from the side of the ship, which is commonly seen at a higher level. So this is just for cargo and vehicles and things of that nature. Obviously, after loading is finished, the ramp is pulled upward and locked into place, and then the visor comes down and then locks into place as well, sealing up the ship. Now, the visor stops at the card deck, and so there is a remaining deck below it, which is part of the hull, and the zero deck where there are some passenger cabins. Personally, I feel like this is just an awful design. I'm obviously no ship builder or engineer, so my opinion is pretty much trash. But I don't feel like a detachable mouth on a ship is a sound design call, and mainly for reasons similar to some that we're going to go over, which are, potential malfunctions. No one wants a gaping mouth on a ship guzzling water if it would break. But anyways, these passengers on the lowest level of the ship below the car deck were so disturbed by the banging and the water that they were seeing that some of them just decided to head to higher decks to avoid the commotion or to actually find out what was going on. This would have proved a life-saving decision for these people in just a matter of minutes. Now, over the next 10 minutes, similar noises were reported by passengers and other crew members. The Atlantic article that I previously mentioned recounts the events through the eyes of one particular survivor by the name of Pierre. What I'll read next will be his account via the Atlantic, so I'm just letting you know the Atlantic article. He begins by saying Pierre was a Stockholm-based shipbroker, age 32, who had gone to Estonia to look over a small freighter and was traveling home alone. He had taken the Estonia several times before, but never in weather so rough. As something of a mariner himself, he believed that the ship was being driven too hard, but he wasn't particularly worried. The article does go on to state that Pierre encountered an associate of his, and they proceeded to head to deck 5, where there was a bar and lounge called the Pub Admiral, and where a lot of the passengers were enjoying like a karaoke night with loud music, and there was lots of heavy drinking going on. And it's here when Pierre, quote, heard a heavy metallic sounding blow that reverberated sharply through the ship's structure. At first he thought it must have been caused by a heavy wave, but it didn't quite feel like ordinary slamming of water. He wondered if a truck maybe had overturned on the car deck, but that just didn't seem right either. The impact was too strong for that. It was almost as if a whiplash had run through the bulkheads, is what he said. Nobody was immediately alarmed at this, and that was probably because of the loud music, the singing, the drinking, the partying. I think maybe it caught people's attention, but nobody actually stopped what they were doing to investigate. And to be honest with you, they didn't have much time to, because according to Pierre, about half a minute later, there was another impact identical to the first. Pierre got the distinct impression that the ship was swerving. He felt a little unsettled, but he reassured himself with the thought that the ship might be turning directly into the waves, perhaps to lessen the rolls of the ship, while the crew tried to latch down vehicles or cargo more securely on the decks, which is, a logical, train of thought, I guess. Suddenly, however, the ship shook with a strange back and forth movement and began to wallow. It rolled to port and starboard a few times, and then rolled steeply to starboard and came back a little, but never fully corrected itself. The initial list was enough to cause glasses to come crashing off a shelf and a speaker to rumble across the floor and collide with the railing. End quote. His account of the initial moments that led to the sinking were mirrored by many passengers aboard the ship. Most recalled the loud bang, followed closely by another one, and then a dramatic list that allowed sheer seconds for a reaction out of anybody. The official report states that at about 1:15, the visor is believed to have separated and torn off and allowed the loading ramp to come down, letting massive amounts of water in. The ship immediately took on a heavy starboard list as water flooded into the vehicle deck. The Estonia was turned to port and slowed before her 4 engines cut out completely. At about 1:20 p.m., the female voice recording over the speakers sounded alarm, there is an alarm on the ship, which was followed immediately by internal alarms for the crew, and then approximately 1 minute later, the general emergency signal. The vessel's rapid list and the flooding prevented many people from being able to exit cabins and ascend to the boat deck. Survivors reported that water flowed down from ceiling panels, stairwells, and along corridors from decks that were not even underwater yet. A mayday was communicated by the ship's crew at 1:22, but it didn't follow the international format. The Estonia directed a call to the Silja Europa, a nearby ship, and only after making contact with her did the radio operator utter the word mayday. Which I guess is not how you're supposed to do it. I think you're supposed to open with mayday, not just be like, hey, anybody out there? Yeah, by the way, mayday. I'm sure that's not what happened, but I guess that's what they mean by it didn't follow the international format. The radio operator on the Silja Europa, Tejo Zeppelin, replied in English, asking if the Estonia was calling for a mayday. After that, the voice of the third mate aboard the Estonia, Andre, took over for Estonia, and the conversation then shifted to Finnish. Andre was able to provide some details about the situation, but due to a loss of power, he could not give their position, which did delay rescue operations. Sadly, Andre would later die in the sinking. Some minutes later, power returned. That or somebody on the bridge managed to lower themselves to the starboard side of the bridge to check the marine GPS, which will display the ship's position even in blackout conditions. And the Estonia was able to essentially radio its position to the Silja Europa and another neighboring ship, the Mariella. This sounds odd, but at this time, ships didn't have the equivalent of the automatic emergency signals that would be sent out when a mayday happens. They also didn't have the black boxes that they have now. I call them black boxes, but it's the equivalent of that for ships that you're probably familiar with on airplanes. The events that happened after this actually did pave the way for many of those changes to be made in maritime safety. So I thought that was sad, but I thought that was interesting as well to learn. But anyway, the ship disappeared from radar screens of other nearby ships at around 1:50 a.m. and it sank in the international waters at that time. It was roughly about 22 nautical miles off the coast of Uto Island in Finland, and it rests at a depth of 280 feet. According to survivor accounts, the ship sank stern first after taking a list of 90 degrees, so completely on its side. This is important to remember when we get into more of the reports that were published regarding the sinking and the differing accounts of how it sank. Now, of the 989 people that were on board, sadly, only 137 of them were rescued from the water, one of which later died the following day. That meant that 850 people died in the sinking. People that represented over 17 different nations. And no one under the age of 12 survived. Again, this was one of the deadliest maritime tragedies in history for a non-war related sinking. And it left a lot of people wondering how this had happened in the first place. Now, initially, the handling of the sinking seemed promising. The country was on the verge of a new election for a prime minister. And the newly elected Ingvar Carlsson promised that the utmost priority was to recover those lost and properly provide them the burial that they deserved. The victims' families were heavily relying on this promise while they awaited answers. About 1 week after the sinking, the newly elected Ingvar appointed to office and immediately kind of started disappointing people, if I'm being honest. Up until this point, the sinking was merely a tragic accident and was caused by, the perfect storm of events that led to its sinking. But the upcoming actions of the government, of the prime minister, and later of other entities involved started to hint that there was definitely something more at play here. Within the first 30 days of the sinking, 93 bodies floated to the surface. They were returned to their families, and about 18 months later, there was one additional body. Aside from that, though, no other bodies were ever recovered. This was odd, considering the promise that Ingvar had made, plus all of the religious, humane, logical, and ethical notions that it insinuated by not retrieving them immediately. This began to upset the public greatly, and people started demanding answers as to why the government was at first not doing enough to retrieve the bodies, but then ultimately outright refusing to retrieve them. This all started when the new minister, Ingvar, appointed a representative to handle the sinking and the investigation that followed. They appointed a woman named Inez Uzman, who was titled as the Minister of Communications. Once she stepped on the scene, that's when the victims' families and the public began to see a shift of priority. Out the gate, Inez heavily highlighted the obstacles the investigation would be facing. She entered pretty much every conversation regarding the sinking and the following investigation with a sort of pessimistic outlook rather than providing, hope and reassurance to the families and the public. She highlighted the fact that, getting down there alone would be a 30-day mission, which later came to be completely debunked. One of the former members of Parliament stated in an interview regarding Inez's comments about the difficulty of the mission that what she was saying simply didn't add up. Inez was saying that the depth at which the boat had sank to was so vast that it was going to cause a serious risk to human divers that were going to be performing a salvage. But this former member of Parliament said that if you stood the Estonia upright, over half of the ship would be above water, indicating that it wasn't that deep at all, and that Inez was essentially inaccurate in her depth description. Now, the root of this misunderstanding, though, wasn't necessarily Inez's fault. She was relatively inexperienced for the scope of work that was handed to her, and she relied on the representatives of the Swedish Maritime Administration, also known as the SMA, for a lot of the information that she was giving to the public. One representative that she worked extensively with was a man named Johan Franzen, who at the time was the chief legal officer of the SMA. Apparently, this was the puppet master, and Inez was the puppet. Johann was tasked with finding the best means of salvaging and investigating the Estonia. Inez was more of just the public speaker regarding the decisions that were made. A few weeks after the sinking, Johann published his report regarding the salvage, where he claimed extensive obstacles regarding the process. And then, of course, Inez backed him and mirrored his findings. Let me turn off my fan here real quick. In his report, Johann claims that the depth and weight of the ship were serious issues, which, okay, but are you a salvage expert? I mean, wouldn't they be the ones to tell you if the depth and the weight were an issue? And if so, they do it in parts, right? But anyway, he also stated that there was a lot of diver risks of injury and even death, which again, if this is such a risky depth to delve to begin with, don't you think that salvage crews have, a means of working around this, whether they use rove machines or, submarines or whatever the case may be, to avoid sending actual people down there? I mean, we saw it with the Titanic salvage, which, by the way, is at a much deeper depth. They retrieved massive parts of the ship, including like a 200-foot piece of the hull. I'm not sure how. I have a picture of it. It's ginormous, so I look like an ant next to it. They brought that up, though. I think James Cameron even went on several of these delves when he was researching the movie that he directed. My point is that human divers are usually used probably for shallower, more reasonable depths, and then you change your approach accordingly. I don't think it was Johann's decision to say it was risky without consulting with, the proper experts on the matter. But anyway, this guy was also listing life rafts that could potentially get dislodged when debris removal happened as a potential hazard. He was claiming umbilical cord damage to the divers or maybe even the machines. He was claiming broken glass, all as factors as to not retrieve the wreckage or the people that were lost. Yeah, broken glass. Anyway, with the publication of his opinions and his quote-unquote findings, the narrative in the media began to shift. It became not so much a matter of when or how to salvage, but more of a if we even salvage. And honestly, this level of reporting started to divide the masses. Many felt that the right thing to do was to recover those lost and provide closure to the families, while others felt that what's lost is lost and it wasn't worth risking more lives. With this type of divide, though, it opens up so many doors for speculation, conspiracy, questions, and ultimately just doubt. You question every decision made regarding the matter, and it makes sense. Rumors that the sinking was the product of a Russian attack, that the Estonia was secretly smuggling weapons and drugs, that the sinking was a cover-up of a more disturbing issue. All of these started to kind of sprout one by one. But the one thing that all these rumors had in common, this common thread, sewing them all together, was why won't they salvage the vessel? More so, we get it. There's controversy, but about how it sank or why it sank. But regardless, shouldn't it be salvaged? That was the big question. And honestly, it's a valid question. The reasons listed are not logical enough for the explanation that is given. So what's really going on here is the ultimate question. This divide, though, led to the government to open up a third contender in the decision-making process. They called it the Ethics Council. They claimed that the ethics were the big bone of contention for the country at this time, and I 100% believe that Johan and his team capitalized on that. They leaned hard on the notion that the ethics of, quote, desecrating a watery grave would go against the major power of religion for many. I mean, I thought the issue was safety, Johan. Now suddenly we're questioning ethics. What about the broken glass? His bouncing around of reasons is definitely a red flag for me, and I'm sure it was for many. The Ethics Council was mainly made up of renowned medical professionals and religious and idealist figures within the country. Now, this would make complete sense if these people were there solely to represent the concept of ethics, that they were hired to do so. But they were actually given the task of deciding ultimately whether or not to salvage. None of these people were salvage experts, nor were they allowed to consult with salvage experts regarding, the risks, the approach, anything like that. They were put into a room and they were given the reports and the information that was solely provided by Johan and his team from the SMA. And they heavily influenced them in some pretty strange and disturbing ways. They exposed them to images of dead bodies, emphasizing that this is what they would all have to be exposed to. These were traumatic images, and it was their way of trying to sway a decision. In particular, Johan and his team of coroners and medical professionals provided images from the World War II submarine Wolf sinking that happened when the submarine collided with a landmine. As you can imagine, these images were vastly grotesque, to say the absolute least, and they were accompanied by an in-depth explanation of how it is to deal with the dead bodies that have been underwater for a period of time, and that more than likely this is what the bodies on the Estonia will look like. Talk about, a biased and traumatizing experience for these poor ethic council people. They also begged the question, though, that is this worth the emotional and psychological damage that it would cause the people working on salvaging the wreck and the people identifying the victims? Was this worth the trauma that you were going to expose these people to? Now, speaking of these people, while the whole ethics council discussion was going on, there was sort of a parallel investigation happening as well. The diving company Rockwater was hired by the SMA to examine the wreck and determine retrievability, which, wouldn't you have had this done prior to putting the ethics committee together? That way you could provide them with the findings. That would be the most logical way to do this, but that's not what Johan did. Anyway, Rockwater was investigating the wreck site at this time. Sorry, I thought I had a burp. Anyway, one of the crew members of the Rockwater was interviewed, and he gave his account of the events of the dive. He said himself the dive was an easy dive. He made the comment that a free diver could hold their breath and dive to that depth. Those were his words. Now, seems a little steep, but I certainly couldn't. But I don't know what a free diver is. But anyway, he automatically discredits Inez and Johan's original concerns of the depth being too great for any diver to achieve. He said that on the day of the dive, the visibility was pristine. You could see 50 meters in front of you. He said the ship was in pristine condition. There was limited, free-floating wreckage or loose wreckage that could cause a potential hazard, the shit that Johan was claiming. He describes using underwater torches to cut through the reinforced steel of the cabins that were in the hull. And this was to be their point of entry into the ship. Now, if I didn't mention it already, this was, like I said, going on during the Ethics Council deliberation, and that was taking place in the beginning of December. So sinking was in September. That following December, both the Ethics Council and the Rockwater delve was taking place. Now, the second major red flag, for me at least, was what this Rockwater diver said next. The diving team says that they were there for the sole purpose of exploring specific areas of the Estonia, that they were not allowed to freely explore it, that there were authorities aboard the Rockwater main vessel above sea level that gave specific instructions on what to do. Apparently this wasn't like a common practice for wreck salvages. Usually the divers, would go down, they'd begin where they felt was the most probable point of entry, and they would work their way around the ship and document everything. That was not the approach that they were allowed to do this particular time, which is odd to me. They were directed where they were allowed to enter the ship, where they were allowed to explore. They were given specific places to investigate, and only those places were allowed to be documented. This is strange, and I don't like this. They were literally instructing them, look here, look across here, do not go that way, skip this area, like directions like that. And what stood out to the divers, though, was that they were never once instructed to take the bodies. The man explained that he couldn't understand this, and that he kept thinking, we're passing by them right here. They're literally floating past us. They're in intact bodies. Why can't we just take them? He said that there were so many of them. There were some trapped in cabins, but a lot were piled up like in the shopping area. Some were still in nightgowns. You could make out lipstick on them, and it looked fresh despite, it being 2 months since the sinking. He just could not understand why they didn't take the bodies back then, that they weren't allowed to. They were completely able and willing to, yet they were not allowed to. He said that this is ultimately what upset his team the most about everything that they saw down there. They documented 125 victims they personally located and were able to and could have retrieved, all in different areas of the ship spanning the length of it. They also put in the report that the vessel was in fact salvageable. Complicated, but salvageable were his words. Ultimately, the only piece of the ship that was ever brought above the surface was the visor, and that was a month prior in November of 94. Tests were performed on it, and we will cover those a little later, which is a whole other weird fucking thing I don't understand. But anyway, come December 15th of 1994, Rockwater delivered their final report to the Parliament. Ironically, so does the Ethics Council, who, by the way, were never made aware of the dive going on by Rockwater that was in tandem with their whole discussion. Sorry, stretch my legs here. Prime Minister Ingvar, who has essentially been a ghost throughout the entire process up until this point, despite promising, that he'd be there every step of the way and busting ass to bring the dead home, is present at the Swedish Parliament the day that the verdict is announced. He states that the Swedish government has decided to leave the Estonia and its passengers at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. They state that it was ultimately a matter of ethics, not finances or technical abilities. And that the emotional and psychological damage the salvage would cause, not just to the public, but to the professionals retrieving the bodies and examining them, was not worth the risk. It's ironic considering the emotional and psychological damage they inflicted on the Ethics Council to come to an uninformed decision, and it's ironic the emotional and psychological damage that it caused the Rockwater team by forcing them to leave the bodies behind. The Rockwater diver said something powerful in his interview, and he said that the argument being made that the trauma inflicted to them salvaging the dead was ridiculous. Leaving them behind was the trauma that he and his team have had to endure ever since that day. It's true that in any situation where handling the dead comes into play will have effects on anyone, and it can be to varying degrees of impact. But to be there and to see them and to essentially have to push them out of the way to continue on instead of collecting them and bringing them back has to be far more traumatizing than anything he saw while he was down there, and that's a very sad fact. Now, like I had previously mentioned, the visor had been retrieved a month prior to the Rockwater final report being released. The visor had been known to have been completely detached from the ship. Witness statements saw it at the time of sinking, and obviously the Rockwater dive was able to confirm that the visor was detached. So essentially, whoever went down there to retrieve it just simply had to grab it and pick it up and bring it back up. There was no, cutting or extensive work that needed to be required to remove it. This is crucial because the retrieval can either align with the events that were ultimately published as the cause of the wreck, or it can completely contradict them. The bow visor detachment had the investigative team already leaning towards the idea that the locking mechanism and its failure was the issue that caused all of this, so their immediate response after retrieval was to test this theory. So the experts run tests on the visor door and the locks themselves to confirm the theory that this is the cause of the sinking. The docuseries shows footage of a test being done. I don't know if it's the exact same test or if it's a similar test, but while in the process of running this said test, the lock of the visor door seemingly snaps. The guy who appears to be the man who's in charge of the test initially looks into the camera with this look like, see, it failed, and this is what caused the sinking. He picks up the broken, lock bolt, and he collects that and places it on the table in front of the camera to show the viewer. But what isn't addressed at all is the elephant in the room, which is when the lock snaps. There's this incredulous bellow of metal snapping that echoes in the entire warehouse, and you can hear it reverberating off the walls, off of the machinery, off of rails, and it's for seconds after the snap. Now, the locks lock into place at port after loading is finished. If they failed in the way that this demonstration showed, I find it really hard to believe that there was no way in hell that the ship would have left the port. And there's certainly no way it would have gotten, 5 hours into a trip and then suddenly just water came in to the ship. Someone at the loading dock, everyone really, even people on the ship, would have heard and felt that snap. I'm not sure if the man's tests aim to prove what I'm saying here, or if there was something else that was insinuated, but these findings were published as part of the ruling in the report of the SMA in regards to why the ship sank. When that report was released to the public, there were third-party experts that immediately spotted several huge flaws in both the timeline and the physics that explained the sinking. These experts actually reached out to the victims' families and their representatives to let them know. The report's timeline, to reiterate what we've earlier discussed, summarized the following events. The ship took off 15 minutes late at 7:15 p.m., more than aware of the upcoming weather conditions. At 12:55 a.m., the first bang occurs, coming from the front of the vessel. This is the vessel hitting a large wave. By 1 a.m., the bow's visor locking mechanism fails, which maybe that's the lock snapping thing, I guess. But regardless, multiple passengers and crew report hearing an unusual noise for the next 10 minutes, but the ship maintains its high speed. At 1:14 a.m., with a zero list, the bow visor falls off, the loading ramp rolls out like a tongue, and the water begins to rush in, affecting balance, and the vessel begins to list heavily to starboard side. A minute later, it is at a 15-degree angle, starboard favoring. This situation is attempted to be corrected by the chief on the bridge by steering into the wind port side, almost like, Tokyo Drift style is what I picture. By 1:20 a.m., the engines stop and the list is now 30 degrees. That's a pretty steep angle within such a short time, if you ask me. The vessel is allegedly taking in 20 tons of water per second at this point. 1:24 a.m., the Estonia radio a mayday that is picked up by the Silja Europa, who asks for confirmation of mayday. A minute later, the list is now at more than 40 degrees. 9:29 a.m., it's 60 degrees. Silja Europa once again asks for confirmation. Estonia reported the mayday at 1:35 a.m., and the vessel is now considered capsized at an 80-degree list. She is now, completely on her side. 1:40 a.m., she is now at a 140-degree list. Like, she's already overextended at this point, according to the official report. Her top deck is now starting to angle downward in an almost roll-over position, and she's starting to go belly up. At 1:50 a.m., she sinks stern first, pulling her bow into the air slightly as she goes down. A total of 55 minutes since the ominous first bang. According to the third-party expert who analyzed this report, he says it's an extremely detailed report, but it's not what happened. A ship this size could not sink that fast without something else causing water to flood the boat. For example, the infamous ferry ship, marine ship Jan Heweluz, probably butchered that one too, I'm sorry, sank 1 year before the Estonia, and its sinking was compared in terms of physics and rate of sinking. They're both considered ro-ro ships, and similar size. I think the MS Jan was maybe only 100 feet shorter. But that sinking is a whole other story of scandal and conspiracy and potentially cursed ship, but we will tackle those details on a different day. But to sum it up, for context, the ship suffered from severe design flaws, accompanied by a poor upkeep that ultimately contributed to it capsizing for an unknown proximal cause, and it killed 55 of the 67 people aboard, I believe. It took the same amount of time to sink as the Estonia did in similar water and weather conditions. She, again, was slightly smaller than the Estonia. She was only about 400 feet long, as opposed to the Estonia's 515 feet long. Regardless, though, this ship, among other ro-ro ferry ships, did not sink the way the Estonia did in terms of physics under similar circumstances. She stayed afloat for a week after capsizing. Actually, several other ro-ro ships, some that caught fire, some that collided with rocks or other ships, either sunk and then resurfaced, or bobbled on the surface for an extended period of time before sinking. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, if water was coming in through the nose of the Estonia, she filled up and sank. Yes. but several physicists that are experts with buoyancy and designs of ships stated that with the rapid list that this ship experienced, pockets of air immediately become trapped in the hull of the ship. Being that the hull is reinforced steel or other sorts of strong metals and has no windows, it is a watertight sealed area. The visor doesn't attach to the hull. It begins above it, meaning that this area wouldn't have remained untouched by the water or the opening for an extended period of time unless there was a breach in the hull. Like, for example, the Titanic and, iceberg. The iceberg penetrated the hull, hence water entered into the ship. Add poor ship design, and you have that disaster. Now, the buoyancy concept, if the hull is not penetrated, was the case for many ro-ro ships that capsized, including the MS Jan. This wasn't the case for Estonia, though. She rapidly listed to starboard and sank within 1 hour. This was a huge inconsistency that can really only logically be explained by damage to the hull that penetrated those formed air pockets that were formed because of the rapid list and the rush of water. Now, I mentioned way earlier that the cabins that sit below the car deck were experiencing water leakage from unknown areas around the time that the loud banging happened. This area is, in fact, the hull. If water coming into the ship was only from the visor breakage, this would have been above this area, and water would only have been coming from the stairwells or areas above that had access to the car deck. Passengers in the hull, though, stated water gushing from the bulkheads, which is the sides, the walls of the ship. That does not correspond with the visor water problem. That speaks to a whole other issue entirely, and I'm not the only person that agrees with that. Now, on top of the physics of their findings not adding up, another separate issue that many had with the conclusion that the accident commission team did was that they never conducted any sort of analyzing of witness accounts and other evidence that contradicted the visor malfunction theory. Many survivors claim that they were never interviewed by the committee at all. Many stated that they were interviewed by Swedish police shortly after the sinking. Some of those interviews were conducted over the phone, but after that, there was no further communication by Swedish police or the committee after that point. Now, the committee's investigation was 3 years in the making, and to never be talked to at all during those 3 years is odd. The accident report had information that you could tell had been misinterpreted by the investigators who had interviewed the survivors right after the sinking. It mimicked sort of like the game of telephone. The statements that were collected had been taken from indirect sources and not from the horse's mouth directly. Another bizarre and completely false handling of the testimonies was the fact that passengers' testimonies were not considered witness testimony and were left out of the final report. The only testimonies that were included were that of the crew members. And that information was, again, regurgitated information. Now, after the report came public, survivors came forward to state that this is just inaccurate of what happened. And, there were a lot of inconsistencies between survivor accounts, like Pierre's, for example, who stated in the Atlantic that as early as midnight, he and the passengers and crew were experiencing violent listing of the ship. And that led to some restaurants closing down due to the furniture and glasses and things kind of toppling over. There was a female passenger performing on stage in one of the nightclub areas who was knocked over from the violent swaying. Many complained of feeling violently ill from the movement, more so than, the usual movement you would feel on choppy water. Now, in that same article, there was another passenger within the same vicinity of Pierre who was referred to as Sorman, and he reported behavior that he noticed well before 1 a.m., stating that, quote, well before 1 a.m. Estonian time, he retreated from the noise to the farthest part of the pub, where he kind of sat in the corner with a couple of friends of his near the opposite end of the exit of the pub. And this was along the ship's starboard wall. During that short walk, Sorman felt 2 or 3 distinct shocks on the deck under his feet. These appeared to not have been the heavy blows that Pierre felt and others, because there was time afterward for leisurely conversation, as he put it. I have found so many differing versions regarding the list and when it started. So keep in mind, the route of the ship was traveling that night passes through that time zone, so that, again, led to confusion on timelines. Some sources stated that the ship took off from the port with a slight list due to weight distribution being improper in the vehicle cargo area. The Accident Commission states that there was 0 list until 1:14 a.m. Estonian time when the visor detached. But passengers distinctly recall a list 15 minutes prior to the official time on the report, which puts it at about 1 a.m. A passenger actually has proof of this fact. He has a photograph of the alarm clock he had with him aboard the Estonia. The time is set for Swedish time, so it's an hour behind Estonian time. So his alarm clock is frozen at 12:01 a.m., which for Estonian time it would be 1:01 a.m. He claims that this is from the fact that it slid off his bedside table and the battery fell out, preserving the time of when the list began. Another female passenger who is staying in the lowest deck cabins below the car deck distinctly remembers the list happening at midnight Swedish time as well, which again is 1 a.m. Estonian time, because she distinctly remembers the beeping of a digital clock somewhere nearby signaling midnight. It's at this time that many passengers recalled 2 very loud bangs that Pierre previously described. Some thought they hit rocks, some thought a vehicle toppled over in the car deck, some even thought they hit an ocean mine or a submarine. The sounds were memorable and big. Immediately after that, one passenger recalls his bed immediately tilting to a rough 30-degree angle. He signals this with his hand, and remaining in that position, not correcting like a normal list would. The man with the alarm clock picture says he prepared to exit his room when this happened. Luggage had toppled over everywhere, blocking the door, and as he pulls his door open, which it came inward towards him in order to open, his door got caught on his alarm clock, which is why he then picked it up and put it in his pocket and had it with him after the sinking. I was wondering, I'm like, how do you have a picture of this alarm clock? But then he explained it later, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. All of these passengers, though, state that by 1 a.m., there was a distinguishable list that was sliding loose articles that weren't nailed to the ground, starboard side, and that the ship was, like, continuing to, like, jerk on this list. However, again, according to the official report, there was no list. There was a 0 list at 1 a.m. These passengers eventually got together and all compared their timelines and their recount of the events. And of these 34 passengers that had gotten together, everyone agreed on the events and the timeline and how they occurred. And again, they all agreed that the Accident Commission's report was false. So they decided to write a letter and send it to the commission to address this. All 34 of them signed the letter, and they demanded a new investigation based on these grounds. Not surprisingly, the government completely ignores this letter. However, the survivors were not the only ones that attempted to contest the official report. A German investigative journalist interviewed 2 key survivors of the wreck. 2 technicians named Henrik and Tannel, who worked in the control platform located in the lower deck of the ship. And they were actually the last people to escape via the chimney that runs from the hull area to the top of the ship, where like the fin is. It comes out right below the fin. She wanted to know what they saw, particularly because they were at the lowest part of the ship and were the last to exit, which meant that they had been in the ship up until the point of the capsize. Again, these men were in the control room, where all the security cameras are accessible among, other ship controls. They were trapped in there until the full 90-degree angle list, at which point that's what allowed them to crawl out of the chimney line. They stated that they saw the security camera that directly overlooks the bow and visor area. They even drew a demonstration to further explain what exactly it was that they saw on those cameras before exiting the ship. They said that the car ramp was never opened and extended. They stated that there was definitely smaller amounts of water that were seeping through the sides of the ramp as it was in the upward locked position, and that the water kind of mimicked like spouting, like as if a wave crashing against it, and it would, splash and then recede, splash and recede. But that it was nowhere near enough water to suggest that, the door had been completely ripped off or was completely agape. And again, it was just not enough water that was coming in to sink the ship, the 20 tons a second that the official report was claiming. So this kind of tells me that obviously there had to have been some sort of visor malfunction for water to be leaking in to begin with, but that it wasn't a complete detachment to cause, again, the gushing of water in that they claimed. So again, if the bow visor is technically still attached, just ajar, and the ramp is in the fully locked position, how is the ship able to achieve a 90-degree list while both of these items are preventing 90% of this gushing water from coming in? On top of the survivors and investigative journalists all contesting the report, another key player in the ship's fate was the manufacturing shipyard. I mentioned in the first part of the episode that it was unclear where the ship was originally manufactured, but according to this docuseries, it was actually made in a prominent German shipyard. This company wanted to immediately protect itself from any accusations that the ship's design was the reason for this tragedy. So they hired experts and, formed their own investigative team to go over the findings and see what could be determined. They took the liberty of interviewing all witnesses that they could, with a focus on those who were in the hull quarters below the car deck. They surmised that the lower compartment of the ship within the hull had to have been filled with water at the time of the list. They concluded a different point of entry from below the ship on the bottom of the boat had to have been flooding and causing the rapid list and, contributing heavily to the sinking. To be more detailed, they insisted there had to be a hole in the hull on the starboard side, which is what I was suspecting the entire time. That was my 2-year-old. And honestly, the way that it sank screams that there has to be a hole in the side. An open front wouldn't list sideways. Wouldn't it list like frontwards and like take kind of like a nosedive approach, if you will? I mean, that's just logic, but I'm not an expert, but that's what it feels like. Anyway, their findings coincided with how the ship actually sank, the facts, and honestly, it was the most viable theory to the survivors at this point in time. This investigation, though, continued on for 5 years as they gathered information and tested their theories and the evidence that they had accumulated. After the publishing of the official and highly controversial report and the ruling to not salvage the bodies or the ship was made public, the next move on the Swedish government's end raised so many more eyebrows and is red flag number 3 for me. They declared the wreckage site a burial site, which on the surface seems fitting, right? Respecting the dead, making it a formal place of rest. But in an ocean used for regular heavy transport of people and goods in international waters, it would be impossible for anybody to avoid this area. However, they went a step further to shroud the wreck in laws to protect it from, quote, grave robbing, which, okay, fine, but they then made the decision that they were going to bury it in rocks and boulders of cement as a further measure to prevent grave robbing of the ship or the bodies themselves of jewelry, belongings, anything of value. This was with particular reference to the bodies, though. I find it funny, though, how if you had just retrieved the bodies, you wouldn't have to, worry about dumping cement blocks into the ocean to protect it from being robbed. I don't think anyone would be that offended by, booze or metal being stripped from the ship. Not enough to spend money to bury the ship, per se. Literally in all my life, research and otherwise, I have never heard of a wreck site being purposely buried to prevent people from revisiting it. Again, the Titanic, for example, the director of the box office smash hit, James Cameron, has personally taken several dives to the site. There are no laws preventing that. There are salvage teams that visit hundreds of wreck sites. I mean, there are careers built around this. There's pirate ships that are explored, treasure hunters, even anthropologists dip a toe in this field. This literally just does not make sense. You are burying a secret and shrouding it in this religious blanket of respect for the dead, and it's really honestly weird. But anyway, the decision to essentially bury the dead in concrete aboard the ship that took their lives 280 feet below the surface did not sit well with a lot of people. There were protests. Families of the victims spoke out against this decision. They saw it as the opposite of respect, but rather, a very forceful level of disrespect. And I'd have to agree with them. However, these actions were quickly followed by red flag number 4 in the spring of 95, when Sweden, Estonia, and Finland, all neighboring countries that share the ocean area that the wreckage is located at, signed a, quote, sanctity agreement banning anyone from diving to the Estonia wreck. Criminal prosecution would ensue should anyone attempt to. This agreement was scheduled to go into effect July 1st, 1995. Now, those 3 countries weren't the only ones that signed it either. I think there was a total of 7 countries altogether that signed the treaty, most of which were considered Baltic nations. However, there was one in particular that signed this treaty that was not part of the Baltic nation, and we'll get into that, I think, in either the later end of this episode or the next episode, but that's a completely other weird what the hell is going on situation. Now, a little side story. There was a woman known as Carita who was a crew member aboard the Estonia the night that it sank. She had met her husband Peter while working aboard the boat as well, and Peter was not working the night that the ship sunk. When he received word of the sinking and the news that Carita had not survived, Peter remembered a conversation he and her had had several months before, if not years before this accident. Given their line of work, they knew the risk of, maritime accidents. They promised each other that if, God forbid, either of them died at sea, the other would do everything they could to retrieve the other and lay them to rest properly on land. Peter became very disturbed by the decisions made by the government to leave everyone at the wreck site. Peter took the insurance money he received from her death, and he decided that he was going to bring her back himself before this sanctity agreement law went into effect. He rented a German vessel, of which Germany was not one of the countries that were going to sign this sanctity agreement. And he hired a German crew, and they were going to aid him via rove machines to recover Carita. Her friends aboard the ship who had survived told him where they had last seen her and where she most likely was when the ship went down. Him having extensive knowledge of the ship himself, Peter felt confident he would be able to locate her and bring her home. The day he set out to recover Carita, the Swedish government caught wind of his plans and met him at the dive site. They began warning him to leave the premises. Repeated attempts to prevent him from pursuing this dive were made. They were yelling fake law off to him that wasn't set in stone yet, and they even proceeded to break the law by making physical waves in the ocean, which is forbidden by international law. So, in essence, they broke the law to prevent him from diving to the site. The government, mind you. Sadly, the waves were successful at preventing Peter and the crew from submerging the rove crafts, and therefore they were not able to retrieve Carita. There were camera crews aboard the ship when all of this happened, and the footage shows him departing the area after having to leave roses for her in the ocean and saying a prayer for her. Peter later passed away from cancer in 2006 at the age of 50. He lays beside an empty plot with a headstone where his wife should be laying beside him. It's a sad thing to hear and to see, and I hope that their souls were reunited in death. Moving forward to springtime of 1996, a ship called the Turtneys arrived at the sinking site of the Estonia under Swedish orders to lay over 10,000 tons of crushed cement around the former Estonia in order to prepare the area for its final burial. Miraculously, though, after a few months, in the summer of 96, efforts to further bury the Estonia in cement were canned after the massive backlash to the decision had finally reached its peak. However, the sanctity agreement still was upheld and prohibited people from diving to or even going near the Estonia site. In 1999, 5 years after the sinking, and the beginning of their own inquiry into what happened, the Meyer shipyard, the people that made the MS Estonia, their investigation came to an end with the publication of their final report. They state that the cause of the sinking was not the visor malfunction alone, but rather a hull in the starboard side caused by, get this, explosives aboard the ship. Talk about shots fired. The media grabs hold of this, and it is broadcasted literally everywhere. Suddenly, all of these seemingly out there conspiracy theories are beginning to hold some water. The representative of this report, Werner Hummel, stated that they did not know who had placed the explosives there or what their initial reasonings were for, but that whoever had placed them there wanted the ship to sink. He clarifies, though, that the explosives were not the main cause, but they sped up the process definitely, and that they were intentional. Now, the CEO of the Swedish Ship Officers Association, I can't even talk, went on television after this publication to state that while the findings seem odd, to say the least, he has full confidence in the investigative team of Meyer Shipyard, and they have a pristine reputation providing quality and accurate reporting on investigations. He also states that the chief prosecutor in Sweden finds both the Meyer Shipyard report and the Accident Commission report to be, quote, equally credible and probable. He says that this should be the fuel needed to re-examine the ship for further clarification. Being that the side in question is the side that the ship is laying on at the bottom of the sea, he understands that this is no simple task, but it is a necessary one in order to finally put this matter to rest. Now, around this time is when the demands for the 1994 Rockwater documentation and videos and images are requested to be seen. Remember, the accident report stated that they fully examined the ship and documented every detail and all the damage, and then they came to their conclusion. The divers, however, had told a very different story. They told that they were strictly directed to certain areas of the ship and were forced to only view those areas. There was no free exploration, and they were extremely limited. So, when the public requested the reopening and the request to re-examine this documentation, much of it has seemingly disappeared. No one can locate it, naturally, and there is no explanation given as to why. Head of the Accident Investigation Committee, Uno Lauer, then is put on the spot. It comes out that while a lot of the ship was documented in detail, it was not documented in a manner conducive with typical sinkings. The word used was systematically. Uno defends this report, stating that they didn't perform a systematic documentation of the ship because they didn't feel it was necessary, because they weren't expecting to find hull damage. Therefore, they didn't go looking for any. Okay, so you're telling me a passenger ship sinks in under an hour in the middle of the sea, and because you think that it was caused by one thing, you're not going to fully investigate every avenue solely because you think your theory is correct. What kind of half-assed, lazy investigation is that? That's not how a professional investigates anything. That's literally the stupidest shit I've ever heard. Moving forward, we are now up to the year 2000. The families of the victims team up with American businessman and diving expert Greg Bemis with the sole mission to dive to the Estonia and document the ever-elusive hull in an attempt to prove that the visor detachment was not the sole cause of the sinking. They made this public too, and so on the day they sailed out to the wreck, along with media boats surrounding the area, the Finnish and Swedish Coast Guard were present, similarly to when Peter attempted to dive to the site. Both Coast Guards make efforts to convince Greg and his team to not make this dive, which was expected to be over a span of 4 days with various trips down to the ship. Now, at this point in time, 7 of the Baltic nations had signed the sanctity agreement to forbid diving to the area. What Greg Bemis also brought to the table, though, was the fact that he was an American and was representing a nation that had not signed this sanctity agreement. This, however, did not deter the Finnish government or the Swedish government from boarding Greg's boat and continuing to dissuade him with threats. Threats that if they were ever to visit either country, whether for business or vacation, they could immediately be facing criminal charges. This is wild because this is literally international waters, meaning that no country owns these areas, this particular area, and that's because it touches several countries. Setting a sanctity agreement on a specific area banning your citizens from diving is one thing. And, that can be followed up with criminal charges should it be violated. But if you're not a citizen of that country, nor if you're not physically in any of those countries, there is nothing they can legally do to stop you. I love this because Greg's team knew this and they dove in and got to work. What they found, though, just added more fuel to this cover-up. Like, it really needed more. But Greg's plan was to head to a specific area of the ship that was worked out mathematically and physically to be the most probable area of the ship's hull that would have this elusive hull that they were looking for. When they get there, though, they found that this particular area that they mapped out to explore had been a focal point for the cement blocks that were dumped on the wreck back in 1996 by the Swedish government before the efforts were discontinued. How fucking convenient that out of all of the entire ship to lay cement blocks around, because that's what they were supposed to be doing, not on top of, but around. They just happened to dump the cement on the ship's hull area where the suspected damage was. However, despite this obstacle, Greg's team did locate a hole. It wasn't a huge gaping hole that they were expecting, but it was still pretty sizable in comparison to the entirety of the ship. Now, being that the area surrounding the hole was sealed by these cement boulders and tons of sand, it was impossible to determine just how big the hole was and if it expanded further. And Greg's team wasn't equipped with the time or tools to remove boulders to confirm the size of this hole, but they were able to collect sufficient evidence to hopefully bring on a new investigation. However, the Finnish Accident Commission this time hit back with a very strange argument. They claimed that based on the footage provided by Greg's team, there was no way that that was a hole or that there could even be a hole in that area. He says that that's because the sand surrounding the area in question should be sucked in if there was a hole and not behave the way that it was seen. They go on to call Greg's team's findings a bluff. Shocker, really. Now, I saw the footage, and while it's hard to kind of determine which way's up and which way's down, what you do in fact see is what can be assumed to be the siding of a ship. It has characteristics of the hull of a ship, including, the rusted color and, the bolts you can see, make out the shape of them and stuff. And you can also tell what's ship and what's water in the background. This hull, I should say, is covered in like a thicker layer of sand and smaller debris, and then you suddenly see this dark oval shape. It's at the bottom of the frame of the video, so you can't see where it necessarily ends, but it's definitely a hole. You can't mistake it for anything else. The video quality is probably like 480, so you can't see intricate detail, but you see like the raised ridges along the perimeter of this hole, making it an obvious hole. It's not like a porthole either, like, a window. It's got this ridging like damage. Now, while the debate between is this or isn't this a hole that aided in the sinking of the ship, there was an even more sinister question-raising theory that began to reach the public. One particular survivor, who was a part of the letters signed by survivors demanding a new investigation, had his experience documented, and like many of the other survivors, it didn't add up to the official report's conclusion. And he had a little bit more to tell about the night the ship sank. This man was one of the previously mentioned passengers that had a cabin in the hull. Just after 1 a.m. Estonian time / midnight Swedish time, he recalled the 2 loud bangs he heard while in his cabin. He recalled the sound being similar to the boat maybe plowing through ice, and with how loud it was. Sorry if you can hear my kid yelling in the background. But this sound, it scared the shit out of him to the point where he leaped from his bed, still in his underwear, as he claims, and he sprinted to the top deck to see what was happening. In less than a minute, he says he made it to the top deck. That's how scared he was. He looked around and he saw nobody out there. But as he looked out into the black night, something caught his eye from below the water surface. Something long, large, white, and it was emanating enough light to be seen from the ship deck. Most importantly, he said it was moving. The man had no idea what it was, but immediately came to the conclusion that the ship had to have collided with it. Now, this man was interviewed by the investigative team of the Meyer shipyard. They asked him countless questions regarding the entire chain of events that night. He told them about this particular moment, and this had the team wondering if it was possible that what this man saw that night, that no one else was able to see at this particular moment in time because nobody was outside, if this could have been a submarine. The man had no prior military or naval experience, and he didn't really have anything from memory to compare to what he saw. However, this information fed a third theory, probably the most controversial theory for this entire sinking, that I haven't mentioned yet, and we will delve into that in what I have now decided will be part 3, because there's just so much information that we haven't gotten to yet. Trust me, guys, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You want to tune in for part 3 because it only gets juicier from here. Stay tuned next time for the vanishing of the Viking Sally / Estonia.